Here's the video for notes 5-4, CPCTC and other fun stuff. So CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So the definition of congruent, congruent means that two figures are the same shape and the same size. So everything about the two triangles are exactly the same. Congruent triangles have pairs of congruent angles and congruent sides. Corresponding sides and angles are pairs of sides and angles that match. In other words, they're in the same position in two different shapes. So when we have congruent triangles, we can match up corresponding parts. All right, so this example says, use the markings on the triangle to write the congruent statements for the triangle and write the triangle congruent statement. Okay, so when we are marking congruent parts in triangles, we mark sides with little ticks on the side. So if it has one tick mark, that matches up with a one tick mark on the other side. And to mark congruent angles, we mark with little arcs in the corner. So the one that has one arc would match up with the one that has another arc on the other side. So congruent statements are statements showing that the parts are congruent. So since there's three angles and three sides in the triangle, when triangles are congruent, you're going to have three pairs of congruent statements for angles and three pairs of congruent statements for sides. So starting with congruent angles, I'm just going to start with one marking. So we see that this angle here, angle B, matches up with angle E. So we would say that angle B is congruent to angle E. Next, I'm going to go to the two markings, although the order that we list them does not matter. Angle A matches up with angle D. So that means angle A is congruent to angle D. And then lastly, we see that angle C has three markings, angle F has three markings, so that means angle C is congruent to angle F. So every marking should have a congruent statement. So all the arcs have congruent statements here. So now let's talk about congruent sides. So we're going to match up the tick marks on the side. So AB matches up with ED. So here's where we need to be careful because the order of the letters does matter. So if you look, I went from A to B. That goes from the 2 to the 3. So I need to make sure I go from the 2 to the 3. So AB matches up with DE. AB is congruent to DE. Another thing you could do is you could use these orders. So I went from A to B, so that should match up with D to E. So it's usually easier to match up congruent angles first, and then it's easier to list the congruent sides because you'll know the order of the letters. So now going from the 2 tick mark, it's going to be this side here and this side here. So we're going to go from the order of the letters. So I went AC, so 2 to 3, AC, so it's going to be DF. So AC is congruent to DF. And again, we can use the order of the letters here, A, C, and D, F. Okay, last side that matches up is going to be CB. And then let's look here. So we went C to B, so that's going to match up with F to E. And then notice my notation here, since these are sides or segments, that's why we use the correct notation here. Since these were angles, we need to make sure we use the angle notation. Okay, so now that I've written out all my congruent statements, my congruent angles and my congruent sides, we can write a triangle congruent statement stating that the two triangles are congruent. So we're going to use the order of these letters to name the triangle. So I know I said in the previous lesson that the order of the letters doesn't matter. When you're writing a congruency statement, the order of the letters does matter. So I'm going to say triangle BAC is congruent to triangle. So I went in this order, BAC is congruent to EDF. So just so we can emphasize that this triangle congruent statement basically shows us which angles and which sides match up, we can use the order of the letters to figure out corresponding parts. So if I look at angle C, that's in the second position of the lettering, which means that it's going to match up with the second letter in the positioning here. So angle C is congruent to angle V, according to the congruent statement. CT, that's the last two letters, so that's going to match up with side VN. And notice there's no picture here. It doesn't matter because this statement here is telling me that the triangles are congruent, which means that they have congruent corresponding parts. All right, now we're looking at NP. So NP is going to match up with TA. making sure we're using correct notation. TAC, so I went TAC is going to match up with NPV. Okay, so now for these set of practice problems, it says complete each congruent statement by naming the corresponding side or angle. So I'm just going to do the first two. These triangles are all marked up, but remember we can also use our congruent statement. All right, so for the first one, it says angle H is congruent to which thing? So let's double check it. So angle H is a third position, so it should match up with angle K. Let's check our diagram. H has 3 markings, K has 3 markings. So angle H is congruent to angle K. All right, the second one, angle U, let's check our picture first. So angle U has 2 markings, so that should match up with angle Y. And let's just double check in our congruent statement. Angle U matches up with angle Y. Oops, angle Y. Okay, so now let's make this a little bit harder where we're giving the congruent statement, and now we're going to mark the triangles and write the congruent statements for the triangle. So first thing I'm going to mark is I'm going to go ahead and mark the angles. So according to this congruent statement, angle A matches up with angle X. So I'm going to put 1 markings on those. Angle B matches up with angle Y. So B and Y both have 2 markings. And then I have angle C matches up with angle Z. So this is nice because the triangles kind of line up so you can see which ones match with what. So now that I've marked those, since we know that every marking should have a congruent statement, let's go ahead and write out those congruent statements. So we said angle A is congruent to angle X. Angle B is congruent to angle Y. And then angle C is congruent to angle Z. So now let's fill in the corresponding sides, the congruent sides, because remember congruent triangles have congruent sides and angles. So AB matches up with XY. So AB, XY, and let's write that congruent statement. AB is congruent to XY. The next one is going to be YZ matches up with BC. And then lastly, we have these last 2 sides. So AC matches up with XZ. So again, every marking should have a statement, right? So if we wanted to kind of highlight to show this marking right here was this statement. This marking right here is the statement. And then this marking right here is the statement. And then the same goes for the angles. All right, let's do a couple problems from the practice here. So again, in these problems, we're giving congruent statements and we're asked to mark up the triangles and then complete the side or angle congruent statement. So let's first match up the angles. So F and L. So angle F is congruent to angle L. Then I'm going to do G and H. So angle G is congruent to angle H. So remember, before you might be thinking, well, wait, isn't this angle also H? Remember, it's a congruent statement between the 2 triangles. So one angle from one triangle and the other from the other. And then lastly, angle H and angle N. So angle H and angle N. The other way you can think about it is using the 3 letters to name the triangle, or to name the angle. Okay, so now let's match up corresponding sides using the order letter. So FG is the first one. So that's the first 2 letters. So that's going to match up with LH. Then I have GH matches up with HN. And then by process of elimination, that means the last side has to match up. All right, so now we can answer this question. So angle F is congruent to angle L. All right, we'll do one more. We have our congruent statement here. So I'm going to match up the angles first. Angle L matches up with R. M matches up with K. M matches up with Q. And then K matches up with S. And then matching up our sides, LM matches up with RQ. MK matches up with QS. And then my process of elimination, we have our third side. All right, so now we can answer the question. So LM is the first two letters. That's going to match up with RQ. We can also look at our mark diagram. LM has one marking and RQ has two markings. So remember, the order of the letters does matter. So this is going to be RQ. Okay, so let's introduce a new vocabulary word, and that word is vertical angles. So vertical angles are opposite angles formed by intersecting lines. Okay, vertical angles are always congruent. So when we're looking at triangles, a lot of times you'll find vertical angles when you see something that looks like a bow tie. So the angles that are vertical in this diagram is this angle right here and this angle right here. So it's the opposite angles formed by those intersecting lines. So because of that, we can write a congruent statement. So let's name the angle that's congruent. So the angle on the left, I'm going to call APB. And we have to be careful about the order of the letters. So we went from A, P, B. So I went down the blank side to the one tick side. So I'm going to do the same thing here, down the blank side to the one tick side. So that's going to be E, P, K. And the reason that they are vertical, or the reason they are congruent, is because they are vertical angles. So if you are marking a diagram as two sides or angles as being congruent, you have to give a reason why you're marking them as being congruent. Information that's given to you is just given, but if you're marking the diagram with your own pencil, you need to say why you know that those are congruent. All right, another vocab word is shared sides. So the sides connected to each other in two shapes are shared sides. And these sides are congruent, which should be somewhat intuitive. Obviously, if these two share the same side, it has to be the same size. So again, we can mark those as being congruent. In the picture, they're not marked as being congruent, but we can mark it as being congruent. So I'm going to use two lines because I see that A, D, and CD are already marked with one line. So we can write a congruent statement here. So I'm going to say side BD is congruent to BD. So order of the letters, we went down to the 90-degree angle, so we're going to do the same in the other triangle. And that statement might seem funny because you're like, well, obviously they're the same. They're called the same line. But we should still write why. So they're congruent because they are a shared side, or they're shared sides.